Honor for me to introduce to everyone. He is the head of surgical gastroenterology and liver transplantation at Hindu Mission Hospital. He is a former senior consultant of hepatobiliary pancreatic surgery and liver transplantation and also adjunct professor at Apollo Hospital, Chennai. So it is an honor for us at Learnet to have Sir in our platform, and with that we would request Sir to please start with his presentation. Meanwhile, doctors, if you have any questions, please put them up either in the chat or in the Q&A section. We shall discuss all of them after the presentation. Over to Dr. Ramamurthy, sir.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And today being the World Liver Day, I was asked to talk on a topic pertaining to the liver. And I thought this being a forum mainly of clinicians and general practitioners and people from varied specialities, it would be a good idea to present many of the myths and the facts that are associated with liver transplantation. So I will talk for the next 15 minutes or so, and I would like this session to be interactive in that at the end of it, it would be open to all of you for questions. So let's begin. So this is a very common myth that I come across in clinical practice, and it is not only a perception amongst the public, but it's also there amongst medical practitioners, wherein people think that liver cirrhosis occurs only in alcoholic patients. But the fact is that of all the patients who present to us for with liver failure for a liver transplant, only a third, one third of patients are in among adults are due to alcohol consumption, so excessive drinking. And it is important that a similar proportion, again, another one third, is due to non alcoholic fatty liver disease or non alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is caused a consequence of the metabolic syndrome. Now, the metabolic syndrome, as you would all know, is a combination of obesity, hypertension, dyslipidemia, and diabetes. And this is a consequence of bad lifestyle choices which have been accumulated over the years. So it was in a publication or in a meeting where one of the speakers said that if we are so biased as a society against people who receive or who come for transplantation due to excessive drinking, then non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is a disease that can be simply put as a disease that is caused by excessive eating. So is it fair to deny patients or be biased against the patients who come with alcohol consumption, is was the question that was asked. And I thought that although it was an oversimplification, it was a very pertinent question. So this is the first fact that I want to share, that only 1 out of every 3 patients requiring transplant are due to alcohol, and 1 out of 3 is due to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 1 in every 5 or 20% is due to viral hepatitis B and C, which is extremely prevalent in some pockets of the country. The remaining 15% is distributed amongst various other causes. These could be genetic causes, that is, inborn errors of metabolism like hemochromatosis, Wilson's disease, familial amyloid polyneuropathy, or autoimmune causes like primary biliary cirrhosis, primary sclerosing cholangitis, etc. Now, note that all that we have covered in the previous 4 points are entirely to do with adults. Pediatric liver disease or small children who come up with liver disease and liver failure requiring transplant are due to inborn errors of structure. 50% of them are due to malformation of the bile ducts called biliary atresia requiring transplantation, or metabolism, which is associated with various enzymatic deficiencies which cause liver malfunctioning and require transplant. So this is the first myth that I would like to dispel. The second myth that patients often, when they come to me in the clinics, say that, oh, but I drink along with my friends. And I know of a couple of friends who drink way more than I do, but they are fine. Why is my liver affected? Now, this is another myth that, you know, just the quantity of alcohol taken alone will determine whether the liver is going to fail or not. Yes, it does determine there is a threshold of consumption beyond which the chances of liver disease go up significantly, but there are several factors that determine liver damage due to alcohol. The quantity and the pattern of consumption, whether people are drinking daily, whether they are drinking in binge, that is over the weekend they may drink, but they drink a large quantity of alcohol in a relatively short time, such as to bring their alcohol level up within a couple of hours to high levels. Drinking on an empty stomach, when they combine smoking and drinking, the effect is not only additional, that of smoking plus that of drinking, but it's a cumulative effect. That is, the combination of smoking and drinking is far more harmful than smoking or drinking alone. Other factors play an important role, such as genetic predisposition to liver damage due to alcohol consumption. Females are at a higher risk of alcohol related liver damage compared to males. If you have concomitant disorders like high body mass index, that is, if you're obese, you are more likely to have liver disease due to alcohol. If you have viral hepatitis, if you have hemochromatosis, or liver disease due to any other cause, then you can develop liver failure with much smaller quantities of alcohol consumption over a much shorter period of time than if you did not have those factors present. So there is no safe level drinking. This people often ask, how much is safe? There is no safe level of drinking for patients who have any form of pre-existing liver disease. Let it be even a fatty liver, but you cannot say that this amount is safe and this amount is more. Even across the world, this awareness is increasing. If you see the US and the European technique, they recommendations or guidelines, they say that one standard drink a day is what is a safe limit in people who have otherwise normal livers. And this one standard drink in the American classification comes to 14 grams of alcohol, and in the European classification, it amounts to 10 grams of alcohol. Now, this amounts to roughly 350 ml of beer, one glass of wine, 45 ml of distilled spirits, etc. So, the quantity of the safe level, which is recommended even in Western countries, is fairly low. The only way of recovering from liver disease, once you already have liver disease, and whether the liver disease is caused by alcohol alone or whether it is caused by alcohol in conjunction with some other factor which can cause liver damage, is complete abstinence or abstaining from alcohol totally. That is the only way to go ahead. Now, the third misconception is liver cirrhosis, once it happens, is not curable. And patients come with often various stages of fear, anxiety, and sometimes even panic. But the fact is that the most common causes of cirrhosis, that is about the factors that account for about 85% of cirrhosis, alcohol, viral hepatitis, lifestyle disorders, are all either preventable, curable, or controllable. If we detect that there is a liver injury and manage or to control that cause before the onset of liver failure or decompensation, the ongoing damage can be stopped. For example, hepatitis B has a effective vaccine to prevent people from getting hepatitis B. It is part of the universal immunization schedule. People who haven't got it and are working in high risk areas should get vaccinated. It's an easy way to prevent hepatitis. Both have effective treatment available to relatively cure the patient of this liver damage. And patients who have non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, if they have undertake lifestyle modifications, then they can ensure a long and healthy life. And this is important not only before transplantation, but also during and after the liver transplantation. Continuation of this healthy lifestyle is extremely necessary. The fifth myth is cirrhosis affects only a part of the liver, and patients have gone so far as to ask me, "Doctor, can we remove a part of the liver so that the diseased or damaged liver, so that the normal liver is left behind?" No, that is not possible. The fact is, cirrhosis is a diffuse change of cell damage, cell death, and replacement by scar tissue, which happens globally across the liver. So when we do an ultrasound or any form of imaging, it shows the volume redistribution, which is characteristic of cirrhosis. That is, you may be able to see a shrunken and a nodular liver. You may be able to see that the right lobe is relatively shrunken while the left lobe and the caudate lobes are relatively enlarged. Now, this appearance on imaging is not indicative of the amount of damage that has happened to the liver. And depending upon the cause and depending upon the stage at which we do the imaging, the liver may even appear normal in size. So the severity of liver damage is actually determined by clinical scoring systems like the model for end stage liver disease or the Child-Pugh score, which would tell us in a better way as to how much of the liver is damaged and what is the next management step that needs to be taken. The sixth myth is mild symptoms. If the patients have mild symptoms, then it indicates less damage. What is important to understand here, the fact is that the liver has a large functional reserve. That is, over 70% of the liver is a reserve. And the liver also has an immense capacity for regeneration. So there are no outward symptoms till this functional reserve capacity or the 70% of this functional liver is exhausted. So clinically, cirrhosis can be divided into two stages. The compensated cirrhosis stage, when the initial the changes are visible or apparent only on imaging, and the decompensated stage, when they develop symptoms of decompensation such as varices, ascites, pedal edema, jaundice, hepatic encephalopathy, etc. Annually, there is a movement 5 to 7% of compensated cirrhotic patients would progress and become decompensated every year. Now, ascites or pedal edema is the most common initial symptom of decompensation. About 5 to 10% of cirrhotic patients develop this every year. Now, the moment a patient develops ascites or pedal edema or any form of decompensation, the mortality rate and the five survival drops drastically. So, the 5 year survival without ascites in a compensated cirrhosis is about 80%. Once decompensation happens and the patient develops ascites, this survival drops to 30%. So this is the about a 50% drop in the survival with a 1 year mortality rate of 40%. The second most important decompensating event is variceal bleeding. So this may be occult and obvious, such as vomiting of blood, but in some patients it may also be discrete. That is, they may be passing black or tar colored stool, and some may notice it and some may not notice it. And but that is also significant. And each episode of variceal bleeding carries a mortality rate of between 15 and 25% at 6 weeks. That is, 1 out of every 4 patients will die after an episode of bleed at 6 weeks after the bleeding episode. The seventh myth is that liver transplant is the last resort. I mean, you see a person or a doctor for a liver transplant when everything else has failed. Their medicines are no longer working, and the patient is unable to get out of bed and is confined to the hospital. That is the time to seek a liver transplant opinion. This is absolutely wrong. The fact is that there are no medicines, nor are there any machines that can replace the liver function. Medication that is prescribed by your doctors for the management of liver failure is aimed at reducing the severity of symptoms, but it cannot bring back the liver that is already damaged and destroyed. The, every organ system is interdependent on one another. The failure of one organ impacts the function of other organ systems, and it's sort of a domino effect. When one organ fails severely, the other organs also start to decrease in their functional capacity, and eventually they will also fail. And most notably in the liver cirrhosis, the first organ to be affected is usually the kidney, followed by the circulatory system and the ventilatory system. And the optimal timing for liver transplant is when the liver alone is failing, but the other organ systems are doing their work or functioning normally. This is the optimal time for referring a patient for liver transplant when they develop any symptoms of decompensation. And when the other organ systems do start to fail, the risk of liver transplantation increases and the success rates decrease. Sometimes we may need to offer a combined transplant, like a liver kidney combined transplant, for instance. The eighth point is when patients come for a liver transplant, they expect that it can be done immediately, like they would probably undergo a gallbladder or a hernia operation. Now, liver transplant is a complex and time consuming and life changing procedure. In certain situations like acute liver failure or acute on chronic liver failure, it can be expedited. But for patients with cirrhosis and decompensation, elective liver transplant, just to give an idea of the timeline, the recipient evaluation to ascertain their fitness for surgery and anesthesia takes around 4 to 5 days. The next major limiting factor is donor availability. If a family member who's willing and is compatible is available in the immediate family, then the evaluation process and getting approval from the authorization committee can take anywhere from 7 days to even 2 weeks, because it requires certain paperwork or documents that are to be produced, procured from the place of origin of the patient, donor, and the recipient. If there is no suitable live related donor from the family available, then the patients have only one option, which is to go for a deceased donor or a cadaveric liver transplant, and on the waiting list for that. And this is something that where the waiting period cannot be predicted and can vary from place to place. Eighth is, people often ask, will the donor be made available by the hospital? Again, a live donor is a family member or a relative of the recipient who's willing to donate a part of their liver to help save the life of their loved one. So the onus of identifying a willing family member lies with the recipient and their family. The hospital can only perform a medical evaluation of the donor to determine whether the donor is actually compatible to donate to the recipient, that is, their liver size and the liver anatomy are suitable for the recipient, and whether the donor themselves are fit to donate. They also help out with the application, the pay for the authorization committee approval, the wordings and who to get it from, and they can help with those aspects, but not with uh, obtaining or making available a donor. So if a suitable live donor is not available with the recipient's family, then the only other available option is to go on the wait list for a deceased donor liver transplantation. The ninth one is, donor surgery is risky. Yes, if we are undertaking any surgical procedure, why surgical procedure? If we are leaving our house and going to our places of work, then we take the risk of an accident happening on the way and us not being able to reach our destination. So every procedure is associated with a certain risk. There is no procedure or nothing in the world that is 100% free. But since the donor is a healthy individual who's donating for the recipient, the transplant team is very cognizant that no known risk for the donor is accepted by the transplant team. Donors are evaluated in detail, similar to the recipient evaluation, for compatibility with the recipient and fitness to donate, and it takes over 3 to 4 days. Having done all this, there is still an uncontrolled, unpredictable, small but finite risk that 1 in 200 to 1 in 300 donors may have a sudden unanticipated complication like an allergic reaction, which may lead to death. But this is extremely small compared to the risk of, say, traveling from one place to another. After surgery and recovery, because the donors are essentially normal to begin with, they can lead normal lives without the need for any medication, any restriction of activity, or regular checkups required. All that they need to do is follow the guidelines which are appropriate for their age and the age and sex and their activity levels. And in surveys done repeatedly across the world, which have surveyed live donors for liver transplant, the majority of donors, about 90% of donors, have been happy with their act of donation. And when asked, they would choose to donate again if needed. So the satisfaction that the donor derives out of this donation process is very high. The ninth myth is, waiting time for a deceased donor is controllable or predictable. The fact is that waiting time, what is when you go on a wait list, when the recipient goes on a wait list for a liver transplant, what does it mean? When the we are waiting, the recipient is generally waiting for a certain person to die of either a road accident or a stroke or some other cause, and that person has to be of the same blood group, and the family has to decide that they want to donate the organs of their loved one. And then these organs are allocated according to well defined and transparent rules which are set down by the state. So, by its very nature, nobody can say how many people of what blood group are going to die in a particular month and whether the organ is going to come to you. Now, we use a world, recognized system for prioritizing recipient. This is called the MELD sodium score. What the MELD sodium does is, the higher the score, the sicker the recipient. So when the recipient is sicker, the chances or the risk of dying is higher, and therefore they are also higher on the waiting list. Some smaller programs may follow other norms, like waitlist time may be prioritized, but these are extremely uncommon, and the majority of programs follow a certain score, which is again well defined and is transparent and is listed on the government websites. So the liver transplantation, this is myth number 10. Liver transplantation is a high risk procedure. No, again, as I've explained, all surgical procedures carry a certain risk, even if it's a minor surgery or if it's a major surgery. What we need to think as the recipient is the risk of doing the procedure, balance the risk of doing the procedure, whereas with the risk of not doing the procedure, because there is no other equivalent treatment or option or alternative for a liver transplant. So if a recipient has a MELD sodium score that is about 20, the risk of dying on the waiting list or becoming too sick to undergo a liver transplantation is 20% every 3 months. That is, if you take three patients, at the end of 3 months, there will be two patients left. Then at the end of a year, another there'll be one patient left. So this is how it works. The 1 year mortality, in contrast of undergoing a transplant, is 10%. That means 90% success rate of patient and graft survival at the end of 1 year after a liver transplant. And after discharge, the patients are expected to live a near normal quality of life and lifespan. Earlier, patients used to find this, we had to explain this separately to patients, that what are the precautions to be taken. Now, with the Corona episode, all the precautions that are to be followed for Corona outside and mingled with crowds and the sanitization and absolutely necessary. Wear a mask when you're in public, and frequent hand washing and hand sanitization. Now, patient survival on long-term follow-up, when you follow all the patients who have undergone transplant for about 10 years, you find that 80% of them actually survive about 10 years as well. So once the patient has survived in the immediate post-transplant period, they are expected to carry out living a normal life. So this myth is also busted. The liver transplant is not a high-risk procedure. The most high-risk thing to do is not to undergo a liver transplant in time. So I'm going to end with this slide at the 10 myths. So I presented a bunch of 10 myths and facts. It does not mean that there are only 10 myths. There are several myths, but I would like to stop here because I want to have more of an interactive session with the audience. That is, so feel free to ask questions in the question answer box, or in the you know or through the voice thing that from Clernet. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I would request all the attendees, doctors, if you have any questions, please put them up in the chat or in Q&A section. I can see there is a question. What's the present 5 years and 10 years survival post-transplant in India and abroad?
So see, the differences are not in India and abroad is not the important thing. The reason why we quote this data is India does not have the transplant registry and the data maintained across the country for a length of time, whereas in Western countries, especially for example the US, they maintain a very meticulous database of every patient who has undergone a transplant. So according to that, 1 year patient and graft survival is between 86 and 92%. The 5 year it falls down to 85%, and at 10 years it's around 78 to 80%. So this is around the survival that we can expect for patients who undergo liver transplantation. So what we tell the patient is the big risk, if you see, is that the immediate or perioperative period, the if they survive the early period after transplantation, the first 3 months, when the risk of complications bleeding, infection, rejection are all highest, then they essentially can consider that they can go on to leading a normal life with standard precautions.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, doctors. If you have any other queries, you can raise your hands also. I will allow you to talk and you can go ahead with the direct conversation. Meanwhile, let me check if there are other queries in the portal. There's another question from Dr. Megha. The development of ascites, is it a bad prognostic factor?
Okay. So that's a good question, and I would just see if I can go back to my um, slide. Yeah. So because this is a very important slide in the presentation, and, let me share my screen again. Yeah. So in this, you see that ascites or pedal edema is the most common initial symptom of decompensation. So classified and decompensated are the two stages that we divide patients with liver cirrhosis into. So ascites or pedal edema occurs at a rate of 5 to 10% every year. That is 5 to 10% of compensated cirrhotics develop ascites every year. And once the patients develop ascites, this is associated with a 1 year mortality of 40%. And the 5 year survival decreases from 80% to 30% in patients with ascites. So there is a really sharp drop of survival in patients who develop ascites, and therefore that is why I'm saying that every time a patient develops a decompensation, sometimes ascites, although it is the most common initial decompensation, variceal bleeding is the other common form of decompensation, but it's not necessary that only these two happen. Any form of decompensation, if it is whether it's ascites, gastrointestinal bleeding, encephalopathy, jaundice with evidence of cirrhosis, then refer the patient to a transplant enable, start the patient on medication, but do initiate a conversation about transplant, and then refer them to seek an opinion from a transplant institute at the earliest convenient time for the patient. So patients often place a lot of faith in their primary doctors or their family doctors or physicians who they have been going to for a very long time. So when I ask patients, sometimes they say that, doc, I was diagnosed about 2 years ago or 3 years ago as having cirrhosis, and then I was started on medication. So when I ask these patients, like, was there a question, was there any talk about transplant initiated? And not very unsurprisingly, most patients say no. Nobody talked to us about transplantation till very recently. And by that time they've already lost valuable 2 years of lead time. To give an idea, it was calculated that the risk versus benefit, there is a risk and there is a benefit to transplant, right? So the risk of transplant is outweighed by the benefits of transplant at a MELD score of about 12. Now there was another study, there were other studies that said no, that is 15. So, but what is important to know that once a patient reaches a MELD score of 12, MELD sodium of 12, or if a patient reaches a child CTP child's class of B or more, then these patients need to be evaluated and for a transplant. And if the patient does prove to have an cause of cirrhosis that is not reversible, uh, liver decompensation which cannot be reversed, then they are better off being offered the options of transplant at an early time. They can use this time to sort out their finances, to look for donors, and then undergo a timely transplantation. When they come to us saying that, okay, now our patient is in ICU, doctors have said nothing more can be done. We are ready to do anything, just save him. And that is the point at which we are equally helpless. We cannot offer any treatment for that patient from that point on, because as I told you, liver transplant needs some time. It's not a very simple and straightforward procedure. And it also determines what is the sickness state of the patient at entry. Sicker the patient at the time of being considered for a liver transplant, poorer the success rate and poorer the outcomes after transplantation. So a timely referral is extremely important.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. There is another question. One wants to know what the expenditure, sir, of liver transplant.
So the expenditure varies from place to place, but I can give you an average. On an average, the liver transplant procedure costs anywhere from 18 lakhs to 25 lakhs across the country. Different centers are different. For example, there are government institutions or autonomous institutes which do it for as low as 15 lakhs, but those are exceptions. The average across the country is around 18 lakhs to 25 lakhs. And add to it, cost of evaluation for the recipient and the donor of about 1 lakh, and the cost of testing and medicines in the first year of about 1 lakh. That is between 10,000 and 12,000 a month for the first year, and then about 5 to 6,000 per month from the second year onwards. So basically, that is the amount that people should look at for organizing or preparing for a liver transplant to begin with. So I would say a ballpark figure would be about 20 to 22 lakhs is something that the patient should look at to organize for a liver transplant.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. There is another query. It's a case of a 55 years female patient of psoriatic arthritis who takes methotrexate once in a week. How to monitor the liver function, and also wants to know about the adverse effect of methotrexate. She is on medication for last 15 years.
Hmm. So, see, there are several causes of liver drugs causing liver damage over time. Again, what is important is that the risk versus benefit. Everything is associated with risk, and everything is associated has its benefits also. So, what is the commonest cause of drug-induced liver injury in our country? The commonest cause of drug-induced injury causing acute liver failure associated with a very high mortality in our country, it is anti-tubercular drugs. So we are all aware of the side effects of anti-tubercular drugs. In fact, I myself, when I see cases of ATT-induced liver injury, used to think to myself, "Oh my God! Like I used to take this so it is a standard treatment, and it can have such serious implications." But what is important is when you see a patient with tuberculosis or with psoriatic arthritis, you need to do the treatment that is required for that patient in that moment. You cannot not give that drug for fear of or drug induced liver injury. What we do is most of these drug induced reactions are hypersensitivity reactions. So there are two forms of damage. One is the hypersensitivity response, which is not related to the dose of the drug. It can occur even with a single dose of the drug. And that is why in the beginning period, when we start giving anti-tubercular drugs or when we start giving drugs that have potential toxicity to the liver, in the initial phase, we ask them to monitor their LFTs after a week, after 2 weeks, then after a month. Now, if the patient does not develop a hypersensitivity response to the drug, then we are safe from one aspect of it. The next is the dose related liver injury. There are some drugs that are cumulative toxicity, that is, they accumulate over time and they can cause liver injury. So that if the patient develops, we ask the patients to do it after 3 months or at the completion of treatment. If the patient has not developed a liver injury till that point, then they are less likely or they are unlikely to develop any further liver injury after stopping the drug. So what we need to do is think, does this patient require methotrexate for treatment of a psoriatic arthritis? If the answer is yes, we have to go ahead and give the treatment. We need to be aware that yes, methotrexate, these are the potential side effects and liver injury is one of those side effects. So what we can do is we examine the patient clinically, we look for features of jaundice, once and with a certain periodicity, ask them to undergo a liver function test. It is very simple. Just ask for an LFT. The added cost of the LFT is going to be low, anywhere from 500 to 750, and that will tell us whether the patient has liver damage or not. If the patient has liver damage, the solution is very simple. After 15 years, it is not going to be a hypersensitivity response. You just have to stop the drug. If you stop the drug, once the drug washes out of the system after 5 half-lives, the liver is expected to recover from the injury that is caused by the drug. Meanwhile, we can also give it some supporters like N-acetylcysteine, 1.2 grams twice a day is a very good. It's used for paracetamol toxicity, but it's also good for the liver. Using other liver supportive medicines, ursodeoxycholic acid, to just support. It's an empirical treatment, but these are liver supportive treatments that can be given during the phase that the patient recovers from the liver injury. So that is it. I would not think go much, worry too much if a patient requires a certain treatment and that is essential treatment and there is no other suitable alternative available. I would explain to the patient that with this drug there is a higher chance of developing a side effect or a toxicity. But this is the best drug that we have in the given in our armamentarium to treat your disease, and I would go ahead with it with suitable monitoring.
Right, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Doctors, if you have any other queries, please put them up either in the chat or in the Q&A section. We'll wait for another 2 minutes and post that we'll wrap up the session if there are no more queries. Yeah, I think there are no more queries. So we would like to conclude the session. But before that, I would like to say that today on Liver Day, it's 19th of April, we observe it every year to spread awareness about the liver related diseases. And through his presentation and by solving all the queries of our doctors, Dr. Ramamurthy sir has successfully aware all the attendees who have joined for the session, and I'm very much sure that it will be very helpful to everyone. We will also post this in our platform, so please keep a watch on that. And a lot of thanks to Ramamurthy sir for taking out time for us, and to all the doctors who have attended the session, who have asked their queries, and for the active participation. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You're all welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please take care of yourselves, all the doctors in this pandemic situation. Take care of yourselves and your family. Thank you all. Be safe.